What is the creepiest thing you found in a forest? 3 piles of stones outside my tent. A dead man. My fire department was called out for a search for a missing person. He was supposed to report back to prison on a work release on Wednesday. We were dispatched on Saturday, after he was reported as a no-show, when someone found his car on a back road. We assumed he had parked there, then called someone to pick him up. Okay, a couple hours wandering the woods, then we don't find anything and go home. 35 minutes in, we find him. He's maybe 50 yards off the gas pipeline easement, just standing there, facing away. You'd think he was taking a leak, until you see the rope. He had hanged himself in the worst way. The tree he'd attached the rope to wasn't strong enough, so he didn't break his neck. His feet were on the ground. He strangled himself. It probably took a while. He stood there, dead, for 3 days. We held his body as our captain climbed the tree and cut the rope. We wrapped him in a tarp and carried him nearly a mile through the woods, back to his car. We sat there for 2 hours while the forensics team surveyed the site and the car. I was a volunteer firefighter for 17 years. That guy is the one that still appears in my dreams. 14 years later, as I walk up the Gasland Trail, I see him standing there. In the middle of nowhere, numerous miles from any sign of humanity, there was a perfectly maintained 2-seater outhouse. It stood in the center of dense overgrowth and trees, not a hint of footprints and not remotely near any path or trail, just there by itself, painted and cared for, unused, and supplied with toilet paper and magazines. As I once described, from the look of the ground surrounding the outhouse, no one had stepped foot there in a very long time. Yet, there it was, available for use. When I was a kid, I found what in hindsight was clearly a homeless person's camp in the woods by some train tracks. There was a shelter built in a tree and a burned-out piece of junk used as a furnace. As a kid, it was just like cool. A fort in the woods. Today I worry what might have happened if someone came back while I was checking it out. An old 1930s-era sedan riddled with bullet holes. I'm sure the bullet holes were from hunters using it for target practice, but at 12 years old I was convinced that it was from a Prohibition-era mobster meeting his violent demise. In college, a group of friends and myself decided to hike a section of the it starting in the Smokies and going north into Virginia for 15 days in early summer. Our second or third night in the Smokies, we were all exhausted but in good spirits. The whiskey was flowing and the joints were passed around. I called it a night fairly early and my tent mate did so as well. About 2 to 3 hours after falling asleep, I'm suddenly woken up from a very deep sleep by my buddy who's shaking my shoulder, and frantically whispering for me to get up. When I finally got up and got my bearings, I asked him what was wrong, and he whispered at me to shut up and listen. About 30 seconds later, I hear a noise that still sends chills down my spine 10 years later. I can best describe it as sounding like a loud vibration in the distance, almost like a loud drum being banged on rhythmically with some type of indecipherable chant following it. It seemed like the drum-like noise and chanting were done in perfect unison, like whoever/whatever was doing it, had practiced religiously. It would come and go in like 2 to 3 minute intervals. Most unnerving, at each interval, I swear to God it got louder and closer. Towards the end of our experience hearing this, it sounded like it was only 30 to 40 feet away. We stayed up and listened for basically the rest of the night, both of us too afraid to leave the tent or do any investigating. It eventually completely stopped and everything returned to normal around 4:30 a.m. We realized we had literally been frozen in place for around 5 to 6 hours, totally transfixed and somewhat mesmerized by the chanting and overall experience. The following morning at daylight, me and my buddy woke everyone else up and told them we needed to GTFO out of that area and keep moving. The really bizarre part was the 4 other guys that were with us claimed to not hear a peep all night, and they each had a great night's sleep. They, of course, didn't believe us, and assumed the whiskey and potent pot, combined with overactive imaginations, was the culprit. I still keep in touch with my buddy on a fairly regular basis, not so much the other guys, and to this day, almost 10 years later, one of us inevitably brings that night up, and we discuss the possibilities of what we heard. It was most definitely supernatural in nature, and it scared me to my absolute core. Man, the only theories we've really both been able to come up with after all these years is that it was some type of Native American chant/ritual. Except in the supernatural form, because it obviously wasn't real, living human beings. We've also considered a Sasquatch as the culprit, but that ultimately didn't seem right with the type of noise and noise level. The only thing I can say definitely is that it wasn't from humans. My buddy owns a lodge way deep in northern Ontario. One of the cabins is an outpost, detached from the rest of camp by 100 kilometers or so. The area is extremely remote and is nearly impossible to find the cabin unless you've been there a lot. Over an hour boat ride after driving down an old bush road for 45 minutes. It's easier to access in the winter by snowmobile. Anyways, Buddy found a tree in the middle of old growth that looked like it has been cut at an odd angle, almost like it was laser cut. He came back and cut the remaining trunk down to keep the cut portion. I know this is anticlimactic, but the level of remoteness, the height of the cut and the angle are inexplicable. I have a picture somewhere. A gutted, decapitated deer. Deer head was propped up on a tree stump. A pentagram was smeared on a nearby rock with the deer's blood. Country folks get weird when they're bored. Not found but encountered. I was smoking with a friend in a forest. To actually call it that is not really appropriate. It's like 2 kilometers wide and 10 kilometers long or more. Anyway, 200 meter away from the street and 50 meter away from the last real path, we sat on some benches in the woods and blazed. BTW, the paths through the woods are completely dark and you can't see shit without a flashlight. Then all of a sudden a dude in a suit and a suitcase came out of nowhere. Not where the actual path should be but behind us, straight out of the forest. It was crazy, no light, nothing. Just walking through the woods. Still can't fathom what this guy was doing there. Not really creepy. But way out in the woods of our old abandoned family farm I found what looked to be 4 old circles of stones roughly the size of adult graves and 2 smaller ones like child-sized. I at least assume they are graves, but it's been in my family since the 1900s and wasn't any of ours. But seriously, no one ever goes out there except me, so I would not be surprised to find a body someday. Cute but creepy story. I had 3 dogs, a Labrador, and 2 pit bulls. We live in a house with a decent-sized backyard with a fence for them to run and play in right next to the woods. We then noticed one day that dog toys were going missing out of the backyard. My dad and I were raking leaves and dumping them in the woods when we found a dog toy. It's cute when you think about an animal playing with dog toys, but then you realize that a wild animal was coming into the backyard. Foxes, coyotes, bobcats, bears, and on rare occasions mountain lions. Went camping with my family in a foggy wooded area, wandered off with my sibling, found a squirrel clinging to a tree at eye level, with a deer jawbone hanging out of its mouth. We went back to the tent and stayed there. I've found bones of animals. In a tilled farm field, I found the newish body of a dog with 4-wheel tracks coming and going from the body. It's a clear case of body drop-off. My childhood home was across the street from school. Elementary, middle and high school buildings were all within walking distance of each other and was in a forested area. So for all of middle school and high school I walked to school. This was in rural Michigan with Old Forest as a green belt. Land belonged to the schools. I wasn't trespassing. Between the school and my house, there was an unofficial trail that was basically a wildlife trail that was tucked back there that I took. It was so beautiful and peaceful. Unfortunately, whether it was because I was a girl or because I wore a lot of black, it really drew some attention from some shitty kids. Kids would shout things to me as I crossed the grass to go into the woods. Things about burning and hanging witches. That I better watch out because nobody would find me out there. Once when I came out of the woods at the road, some male high school students driving home chucked a glass bottle at my head that missed by inches. The worst thing that came out of that, though, had to be on 2 separate occasions finding knives stuck at eye level in trees along the path. One was a knife for skinning with a super ornate handle and the other was a basic fold-out. I kept them both cause FCK them. Somebody watched a middle school-aged girl walking home through the woods and took the initiative to plant knives where I would find them walking alone. Abandoned tennis court. Not creepy in and of itself, but the way it was laid out really seemed like some post-apocalyptic world. It was on a hillside, so one half was sunk into the hill with a retaining wall. It was creepy because it was just left there. The net was still there but was slowly falling to pieces on the ground. The retaining wall side was completely full of leaves. Roots were coming through the playing surface but not a speck of graffiti anywhere. The creepiest thing was how it was so close to the still-in-use court and a swimming pool, but it was completely silent in the court. I was on a summer swim team all through my childhood and swim meets are not quiet. But despite the noise and the proximity, totally silent in that court, Like you crossed some supernatural barrier that isolated you from the rest of the world. We live in rural East Texas in what is considered to be the Bigfoot capital of Texas. My family has lived on our property for over 100 years now. In the late fall of 2020 we began having what most would consider odd activity on our property. Now to preface, our property is mostly woods and swamp and butts up against more properties that are even less visited that are also forest and swamp. Some of the neighboring properties only have people visit for a few days each year in deer season and are otherwise vacant of humans all year. And some of the waterways get into pretty dark and isolated stretches of river bottoms. In the evenings around sunset and into the earlier hours of the night we began to hear on occasion odd bird-like whistling noises coming from the woods across the road in the forest and swamp area. Our homes are on the other side of the road from the undeveloped property and these weird noises would come from in the woodline near and after nightfall sometimes. It sounded like birds whistling and chirping. Except it didn't sound exactly like birds. It sounded like something doing a really good job of mimicking birds whistling and chirping. This went on for months but sadly I never got any audio recordings of anything. My father, an experienced hunter and woodsman, said he kept trying to locate the source of the noises but when he would get closer to the woods the sounds would move away from him, further into the woods. He said it would continue to do so almost as if whatever was making the noises was trying to lure him into the woods. Having seen too many movies he opted out of that situation and went into the house. This all climaxed in January 2021 when I went out to our vehicle to get something from out of the back of the vehicle and suddenly from not far into the wood line I heard the most chilling noise I have ever heard in my life. As I was retrieving my bag a loud animal type roar erupted from the wood line near the gate that accesses our property, which is located just opposite the road as my driveway. I have spent my entire life studying and working with animals, namely exotics. And the best I can compare the sound to was a large male silverback gorilla roaring. I want you to understand that this sound was sound primal and alarming that I actually mildly pissed myself reflexively. I searched for days on YouTube and the closest sound I found was a video of a male gorilla at a zoo suddenly roaring to intimidate some onlookers. And it gets weirder from here still. Not being one to simply assume my family is being haunted by some monster, I decided to grab my headlamp, sidearm, and AK-47 rifle and head down into the woods to see what was making these sounds. I wish I could say that I saw a huge Sasquatch and had some epic shootout but I didn't. I sat in my vehicle in the woods in total darkness for some time. I even played the Sierra sounds over my vehicle's speakers to see if anything would show up but sadly and perhaps thankfully nothing did. However, before leaving the woods I headed back up to our cabin to make sure everything was normal around the cabin. We have actually had people break in before so I wanted to make sure everything was as it should be. I searched the immediate area with my headlamp and rifle and while there was some large animal that stayed just out of my line of sight due to thick undergrowth, I am mostly certain it was a feral pig, which can get very large and dangerous. The oddest pet of all this is that when I checked this slough, a semi-permanent body of standing water, near our cabin there was an animal in the tree I still cannot identify. This small animal was about 2 feet tall sitting on its haunches and about a foot wide. It had no obvious or visible tail and appeared to clearly have 4 appendages. It was invisibly some sort of mammal but since the water was higher than normal due to a wet winter I couldn't get a better angle or get close to it without wading out into icy water. This animal had silver-colored fur with texture rather similar looking to that of a chinchilla. And for all my attempts it would never show its face or paws as it kept all those distinguishing features tucked into its body like it was sleeping despite it clearly reacting to the sounds I made on the ground. I have tried for everything I can think to identify this creature. It was not a opossum, it was not a raccoon, it was not an owl or young owl with downy feathers. I cannot place this animal with any local species of fauna even if it had some health issue like mange. The closest thing I have been able to find is a silvery gibbon, which are obviously not native to eastern Texas. My wife still half jokes that I found a baby Sasquatch tucked away in a tree by its parent and I honestly don't know what to think about all of this. But after that night we haven't had any more strange activity that I am aware of. I am a very open-minded yet rational person. I have grown up in these woods, I have studied and kept numerous animal species, I have helped with government ecological projects in our area. I have taught biology and ecology classes. But this will baffle me for the rest of my life. Did I find a baby Sasquatch? Sorry this turned into a bit more of a written piece than I expected it to become, but this is one of those stories that my husband and I still trot out occasionally to this day. It wasn't exactly in the woods, but it was, as best as we could tell, on uninhabited land that was surrounded by forest on all sides. So woods adjacent, at the very least. Most of my family for the longest time was centrally located in Florida, going back generations. That's changed as people have gotten older, passed on, and of course needed to move out due to the job market in the state stagnating. But back then I was sort of the black sheep of the family for being one of the very first to get out. I still tried to make trips down there to see them, though, when time and money allowed for it, since I was still an early 20-something trying to keep my head above water, financially. Anyway, for this particular trip I decided to introduce my then boyfriend, now husband, to everyone, and on top of for once having company on an extended road trip, it was also time for us to try out our shiny, newfangled GPS to get us to where we were going, since it had been long enough since my last journey that I didn't really trust my memory to lead me through Florida's roads, at least, not until I was in my home city proper. Turned out to be an almost entertainingly terrible trip. We were hit by fog and rain at the state border, to the point where visibility was nearly zero. And for one of the few times that I'd seen in years in that state, we got hit by hail in big enough pieces that it eventually broke one of my car's wipers. After debating whether we wanted to chance stopping to try to find a place to pick up a replacement and essentially having to navigate this terrible weather with an increasingly shaky GPS device, we were at the least inhabited stretch of the main road, and the instruction set that device drew from definitely reflected it. In the middle of the night, we decided to keep on trucking, and I made do with what visibility I could. Besides, I figured being able to read the road signs wouldn't matter so much since we had our computerized road map giving us instructions. Well, that's what I thought. Except at some point that calm, mechanical voice instructed us to take an unexpected turn off the main road, and after a little bit of back and forth with my we half-jokingly decided to go with the flow and take it. Figuring we could easily make a U-turn if it was completely off the mark. For all we knew, it was operating with information about some kind of road obstruction or accident that we couldn't see yet, because the weather was still absolute crap. So we drive along for a good amount of distance, and pretty much within the first couple miles every other bit of traffic has dropped off. Then a few minutes and another turn later the road makes an abrupt transition from concrete to gravel, and I shrug my shoulders and chalk it up to at least a somewhat entertaining dogleg in our trip. Even if I still couldn't see any of the landscape in this soupy weather, I tell my to just keep his eyes peeled for a good place to turn around, since our two-lane road has turned into an unpaved, one-lane path with a ditch running up each side, surrounded by increasingly heavy trees. One bit of silvery lining, though, is that the horrible spew falling from the sky at this point finally pauses, giving us a bit of relief and making me not so afraid of getting our car stuck in mud while making my eventual turnaround. That also means we get an unobstructed view as the woods break on one side of us, revealing what looks like an old farmhouse sticking out like a sore thumb, and, hoo boy, we both fell absolutely silent when we saw this thing. It looked very abandoned, which is itself not unexpected. Florida backcountry, as I was familiar with, tended to be flat as a pancake, with fields and sporadic wooded sections. And every once in a while you would get some abandoned building, usually from someone who owned more land than they could maintain or just couldn't afford anymore. This fit the bill with its empty, broken windows and peeling whitewash boards. Although it had a surprisingly well-maintained clear space around it, with evenly cut grass and a stretch about as big as a decent-sized yard, and festooned around that clear space, sometimes sitting up on pieces of raggedy furniture or set up in little dioramas on the saggy porch of the building, are dolls. Literally hundreds of varyingly shaped dolls. Sometimes marionette types, with worn-down joints. Or stuffed Cabbage Patch style, one human-sized mannequin, set on a rocking chair so that it stared at you not 5 feet from the road. Which was especially disorienting because the fog hadn't cleared fully, so you just saw this head and shoulders emerging from the mush before you could see it wasn't actually a person. And I'm not ashamed to say I veered over as sharply as I could on that narrow path because it fooled me for a handful of seconds. We're both rubbernecking like crazy as we pass this thing, because the more you look, the more you see all the attention to detail someone went into to set everything up. Some of the dolls are sitting at tiny, doll-sized tables, having tea with one another with cracked and dirty glasses. Some of them have clothes, but no hair. Some have hair, but are slumped on the ground like they've been forgotten, while others are very purposefully placed. I can't even imagine how much effort had been sunk into that little, abandoned house, but only on its doll residents. We passed that place by without a single word said, waited until it had finally veered out of our sight, and then I turned us around regardless of how narrow the path still was. We had come to the silent consensus that our little side trip was now done. When we went by that place again, I was going about as quickly as I judged our janky lemon of a car could go, but I'm sure Hubs got another good eyeful the second time around. Nowadays, we still occasionally reference the dollhouse when talking about trips to Florida, and then one of us will air guitar or riff from the dueling banjos of Deliverance. But it's definitely one of those things you only find entertaining from several states away, and not with a dead-eyed mannequin staring seemingly directly at your car as you drive past. We live in a rural area. On the very far edge of our property is a random set of stairs. About a story high. I didn't even care at first. Just told my husband whoever dumped their Reno trash out here sucked. Then he introduced me to Reddit stairs and the woods stories and shit. He had to make rotting house litter creepy instead of it just being a climbing and lockjaw hazard. Now I'm too damn irrationally scared to go back to that creepy corner in our woods and have forbidden the kids, telling them the crazy neighbors own that spot and shoot trespassers, to keep them from going back there. Stupid creepy nightmare stairs. An elephant. Seriously, in the woods near White Lake, North Carolina. We were out exploring and came across an apparent dump site for unwanted fiberglass animals, probably from mini golf type places. Further exploration led to the elephant's mother, lying on its side, an orca, and an extra creepy mannequin that I thought was a dead body at first. It's ever a mannequin, but in this case it thankfully was. For years afterwards I plotted how to get that baby elephant, but no luck. White Lake elephants. The abandoned remains of a cheese factory, complete with Industrial Revolution-era train tracks in the Catskills of upstate New York. My cousins live on property that was once my great-grandparents', so my mom spent most of her summers up there growing up, as did I, when I was about 6 or 7. And my older cousin convinced another cousin and I to sneak off to see it. It was on private property. The creepiest part about it was just how secluded it was. Found out from my mom after that if you followed the train tracks, it led to some kind of gorge. Apparently, there used to be a bridge on said gorge, but the bridge had collapsed with the train on it and killed everyone on board. My mother said when she was a kid they'd found a shoe and a hat near there, and one of my cousins has railroad spikes they'd taken from the train tracks. I've always wanted to go back. A large spine and rib cage in a tree. It was likely from a deer, but the tree was too small to climb, at least for anything that could carry a deer. Either it was dropped by a bird of prey, we have bald eagles and ospreys, or a person put it up there. Added to add, as far as we know, there are no big cats in the area, and this was a small tree right on the edge of the trail anyway. Big cat seems very unlikely. But we have watched bald eagles all summer, and have seen ospreys moving in recently. They're massive, massive birds, so large that I worried it was aiming for the swans earlier. Thankfully it was just fishing. It's not what I found, but what I didn't find. Me and my sister were terrified of our Furbies as children. We were 100% confident they were sentient. We buried them in the woods. 10 years later I went back to that same spot to dig them up out of nostalgia, and they were not there. Probably dug themselves out. For setting, I live in Ireland. We don't have bears, wolves or big cats here, not including private collections/zoos. We do have frequent rumors of big cat sightings and farm animals being mauled by them, but nothing has ever been caught. My dad, myself and a family friend were antler hunting on a private property with free-roaming fallow deer. We had the landowner's permission, and we had been searching the woods for around 2 or 3 hours with very little success. Anyway, in the middle of an open field we found a deer carcass that had been ripped to pieces. The fur was scattered in a similar fashion to how a cat would pluck its prey, so we got nervous. Later we wandered into a dense forest and I found 2 freshly severed rabbit feet. This can be easily chalked up to the raptors, buzzards/birds of prey, but then we found a freshly severed deer leg. It was around that exact time that we also noticed the forest had fallen deathly silent. We did not wait to see what was lurking, we bailed and never went back. Not nearly as creepy as the other comments, but an antique steam engine full of and surrounded by insulated lunch bags. It's not far from where I live on the other side of Gold Creek in Juneau, Alaska, really easy to get to, yet I've only ever heard it mentioned by one other person. Supposedly it was all collected by an old homeless guy that also buried filled water bottles and multi-plastic wrapped assorted trinkets like he was prepared for some sort of disaster. Apparently he was kicked out of the homeless shelter for not bathing and would only eat out of trash cans. Even when offered food, it would have to be disguised as garbage and live a very isolated lifestyle. At a later date, for quite some time I had wondered why he had a mannequin sitting up at his in-town cave just above the Red Dog's saloon, so finally asked my BF at the time to go investigate with me. Turns out it was his partially mummified corpse sitting in a chair. You could see him from the doors of the bar, but no one ever looked up, I guess. Saddest part was the whole time he lived in Juneau no one ever found out his name and just called him Trash Can. When I was in the 8th grade, I went on a 10-day backpacking trip along the Appalachian Trail, mostly through western Massachusetts. On day 3 or 4, after setting up camp, a few of us wandered deep into the woods and stumbled upon an airplane wing. It was really haunting to find it there, by itself, in the middle of nowhere. We searched all around the area, but didn't find any more of the plane. But we had camped on the edge of a lake, so it's possible that the rest of the plane was at the bottom somewhere. We meant to tell the authorities when we got back, but by the end of the trip, we, being stupid kids, had forgotten about it and never did tell anyone. Every once in a while, something like this post will remind me about it, and I wonder whatever happened to the passengers and the rest of the plane. Edited to add. Okay, so curiosity got the best of me, and I did a little research just now. It turns out that the plane, a Piper, crashed in 1967 near North Adams, Massachusetts. There were 2 fatalities. The rest of the plane wreckage is located about a half-mile from the wing, and is still there to this day. Oh, not sure if this was just creepy or straight dumb. Drove out down this gravel/dirt road, not knowing it was actually a hole in the fence to a military base. Covered my car, grabbed my gear and dog, bedded down, went to bed. Next morning went exploring after setting up a fire and heard guys yelling. Obviously I'm an idiot, and try to sneak up, only to realize I'm on a haul overlooking a motor pool. Hear a click and was told not to move, get handcuffed and brought to my camp and have to explain to a couple of really pissed off MPSY/ how I got onto the base. They didn't believe me. So I had them drive down this dinky roadway and sure enough they were satisfied I wasn't lying. Did get yelled at though. My friends and I used to hike and camp up by French River in northern Ontario. For anyone unfamiliar with this area, it is extremely remote. You have to leave your car, canoe a few hours, then carry your canoe to your campsite. On this occasion we were camping for 10 days. There were 4 of us and we didn't see another person or any signs of anyone else near us. On day 3 we decided to wake up early and hike along the river going north. One of my friends was really good with maps and planning hikes for us, and he said that this one is about a 9-hour hike, there and back to our campsite. We started our hike at 6 a.m. and around noon stopped to swim for a bit in the river to cool off, followed by some lunch that we packed and a beer or 2 each. We started packing up again and noticed a small cabin off in the distance about 25 meters downstream. We knew we would come back this same direction and we put our garage in a bag with our beer cans and hoisted it up over a tree. This is a common thing to do while camping as it keeps wildlife such as bears away from getting into your garbage. We knew we would be back the same way in a few hours to collect our garbage to bring back to our main campsite. For the remainder of the hike, I couldn't help but feel like someone was watching us. But there were not other signs of people around us. When we reached the end point, nearly exhausted but also satisfied with how far we had come, we debated stopping again for a rest before making the 6-hour walk back to our main campsite. As we discussed, I mentioned that I kind of just want to get back to our campsite because I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. 2 of my 3 friends then also admitted they had a similar feeling, so we decided to head back. As we approached the area where we rested and swam earlier, we came across our garbage bag. It had been removed from the tree and emptied. The weird thing was that it wasn't ripped or torn as you might expect from an animal. Instead it was untied and neatly emptied and left wide open on the ground. We remembered the old cabin downstream, but there was no sign of it this time. As we walked a little further, we saw something on top of a rock. It was our beer cans. We consumed 2 each, so there were 8 empty beer cans. Only they weren't just scattered on the rock as you might expect from an animal. They were neatly piled in a pyramid-type shape. As we got closer we realized to the cans, we noticed a Polaroid photo tucked under the bottom one. It was a photo of the 4 of us, swimming. Completely freaked out at this point, we half ran and half walked back to our campsite. We arrived at dusk and decided that this night would be the last night of our originally planned 10-day camping trip. None of us slept a wink that night. We stayed up by the fire, terrified and hoping for morning to come. By sunrise we packed up, and hiked out with our canoes. We were so happy to see our vehicles where we left it and drove home together in silence. Middle of nowhere in Alaska, me and my stepdad find an abandoned car. It was creepy cause it looked perfectly clean, literally perfect dealership clean, and there were no roads or trails for miles. We were on four-wheelers hunting. There were no tire tracks, the interior was spotless clean, and the keys in the ignition. How this car even got there in the forest, who knows? No way it drove there on its own, who knows how it didn't get scratched up, or why a spotless new-looking car was abandoned in the middle of nowhere. It didn't have plates. We go back about 7 miles until we get cellular service, call up a trooper friend. A few hours later they arrive, we go back to the car. It's not there anymore. There are marks where the car sat in the snow but no tire trails going anywhere. It hasn't snowed since yesterday, so no way new snowfall covered any tire trails. We search around for another few hours before giving up. Trooper friend keeps asking my stepdad if we are just messing with him. I found a loaded pistol wrapped in plastic wrap and shoved into a creek bank. I was working for the state doing water quality monitoring at the time, so I technically wasn't allowed to have it in the work truck, but I knew I should take it to the sheriff and I was an hour's drive from a signal, so I carefully removed it, took a GPS point and pictures of where I found it and brought it in. A chair, but like a sofa chair that would be in an old person's house, and it was, think you were walking and you see it, facing sideways so you can see the side of it. It was in fairly good condition, except you could tell it was old, but it wasn't like broken. I grew up in Ireland and we frequently played and explored in the local Norman castle that was built in my town around 1206. One day we ventured far into the woods past the castle and into a section over the river we had never been to before. We stepped into a thick bushy wooded area. We first saw some grocery bags tied to trees almost as markers, then it got a little more sinister with dolls' parts strung up and other kids' toys just dangling from branches, and finally in a small opening a small structure that felt like an altar with animal bones and skulls. I distinctly remember us not being afraid for some reason, and kind uniformly had the attitude of "huh, that's weird," and just turned around and left. More than anything, it's the reaction I remember as having that creeps me out. Like we should have been shitting deep to our socks. If I remember correctly, we would have been about 14, so would have been the early 2000s. I remember as a kid used to go wandering up into a forest near my house in Ireland. There was an old derelict house there, really old one, ceiling caved in etc., but you could walk around a couple of dark rooms. On the windowsill there was a statue of Mary with the head snapped off. I used to have nightmares about that house, and it was only about a 15 to 20 minute walk away. Went back there last Christmas for the first time in years, and they had completely cut down the forest and the place was somewhat serene and beautiful. In Maine in springtime. I was staying on a remote farm in a converted barn. Of course, it was at night. I was going out to my van through a tall grass field to get my smokes, about 100 yards. Didn't bring my headlamp because the moon was out. On the way back, there was a tree stump in the trail that I didn't notice before. I stopped, mystified, trying to catch its outline. It stood up on 2 legs. I nearly shit my pants. It was about 3 to 4 feet tall and hobbled over to me like it had a limp. I ran into the barn and yelled at my friend to come out, but she was pale as a ghost. She said never talk about it again with her. A little backstory: earlier that day we had been exploring in the woods nearby and came upon a weird stone circle in the woods. Wasn't much, but the rocks were partially buried and overgrown with weeds like they had been there for a long time. Another weird note is that this thing, whatever it was, walked exactly like the lady who owned the land. She had polio as a child and walked with a limp. It was weird. No idea what it was, don't want to know. I used to play on Stala Bridge Country Park. Typical low-level grasslands, a few small lakes, streams all at the foot of a reservoir in the hills. There was some sort of walkway through marsh. One day found an abandoned ice cream van. Not that creepy. But as a kid I was terrified there was a skeleton in the driving seat. When I was 12 years old, about 17 years ago, I found this cool-looking tree way back in the woods behind my house. I lived in the middle of nowhere, so there's lots of woods back there, and when I got closer, I noticed there was something in the huge opening at the bottom of the tree. It was a bunch of really old glassware such as cups and bowls wrapped up perfectly in old newspaper, Super random and creepy, like why would someone put that stuff in a tree way back in the woods? When I was little, I lived in a small clearing in the forest. My dad would go hunting, but not for sport. He would bring the deer he hunted to a butcher, who prepared the in exchange for the antlers, probably more than that. I was very young and didn't listen too closely to business talk. Because he would go hunting, my dad would warn me to never go into the woods without him. I didn't fully grasp why I couldn't go by myself, but I listened. Mostly, knowing that my dad was talking about deer a lot lately, I assumed there would be lots of deer showing up. So when my dad went into the forest again, I waited by the forest, hoping to see any deer. But they didn't seem interested in getting that close to the house. Naturally, if the deer wouldn't come closer, I'd go to them. I don't think I went in very far at all when I saw something that sent a chaotic pileup of signals to my brain. I almost didn't notice it until I heard someone's voice. In front of me was lots of blood and a something bound and dead by a tree. The voice called out again, and that's when I finally noticed it. Some sort of humanoid shape in the trees, trying to get my attention. I had already seen Predator, thanks to my dad. So what I registered was a dead man next to a tree, and the predator using its voice mimic to get my attention. In reality, it was one of my dad's buddies. Technically two of his buddies, since another was nearby attending to the deer, I guess. I dunno. Reality and fiction kind of blended together for a hot minute. What I'm certain of is getting a spanking from my very angry dad. I know now why he wanted me to stay out of the forest, bullets, wildlife, and maybe the predator. Horseshoe Lake, Mammoth Mountain, California. There's a fantastic hiking trail that loops around the lake. About a quarter of the way in is the foundation of a house and bits of the chimney. The lake is known for carbon dioxide poison gas seeping into the soil and killing trees and providing a moderate danger to anyone or anything under 1 foot tall. This is likely why the house was abandoned. However, a few meters off the hiking trail I discovered the foundation of something. I couldn't figure out what it was, and not even our/architecture could definitively identify what it was supposed to be. There's a giant forest right next to my house. I sometimes go down there to draw, chill, take pictures, etc. One time I was laying on a hammock that was set up by the people who last lived there. I lost my balance and fell out the hammock, and right before I fell, I saw a knife sticking straight up in the air. Planted in the dirt so it would stick right up. The knife did not stab me, but it caught on my sweater, and I was just thinking how lucky I was. Also right by the knife, there was a wooden cross. Like a 6 by 6 foot wooden cross. I don't go to the forest anymore. Happened a few years ago when me and my buddies went into the woods at around 9 p.m. To get to the woods you have to cross an old road that leads to Waterworks factory. This road separates the housing estate and the woods. Well, we were crossing this road and decided to enter through a different place we'd never been to before, and we were only halfway down the road when something whistled at us. You maybe think it's probably just your mates or something like that, but this was different. We knew it was coming from the bushes almost instantly and legged it back towards the houses. Naturally my fight or flight impulses kicked in and I ran, but in the complete opposite direction to my buddies. They ran back the way they came. For some stupid reason I ran straight towards the place the whistle came from, realized I was going the wrong way, screamed, saw a silhouette of a man in the bush and nearly fell over trying to turn around. We all regrouped and made the ultimate collective decision to go back in. Nothing. No person, no second whistle, no speakers or anything. The silhouette I saw was gone, so we went into the trees and found an opening, like a little circle of ground in amongst the trees. We found a little teddy bear, as if it was deliberately placed and positioned where it was. Sitting on top of 2 twigs made to look like a cross, and 4 other sticks holding the bear in place. We took a picture, left, and never came back. I have since lost contact with my buddies due to me starting college and them entering their final year of high school. But I tried going there through day just last week, but all the paths have been blocked. Fallen trees due to recent red warning winds in the UK. Storm Arwen ruined a beautiful forest, and buried a mystery we never got to solve. I was wandering around near a bike trail at an ex's house. This was in northwest Indiana. I found a large, blown-up metal tank overgrown by trees. This could only be reached by foot or bike now and was in Broken Hills. It had been there a long time. I want to believe it was an old whiskey still from the Prohibition days. An abandoned house. A former friend led me there and I saw a bottle of cough syrup that expired in 1945. I also saw faded documents from the US Navy. Sadly they were almost illegible past the logo/header. Come to think of it, I don't know if it was legit because I don't know what military documents look like. I wanted to investigate more but the structure was not very safe and I'm a weenie. I want to go back and explore more because it sounds impossible, but I don't know how to get there anymore, so the mystery remains unsolved for me. I live way out in the woods. One night, in November, mind you, I found a lit jack-o'-lantern sitting on a rock while walking my dogs. Creepy for a moment to see a glowing face out of nowhere, but I suspect it was our neighbors at the time who had a young kid. When I was 12ish, a friend and I snuck behind this house that was at the end of a neighborhood in the small town we lived in. There was a huge field behind it, full of wildflowers, and the field was surrounded by a circle of trees/woods. We were running around exploring, and when I went into one section of the woods I found a small fire, a dead, skinned bird, and a Playboy magazine turned upside down on a log by the fire. It was horrifying and I always wonder if I narrowly escaped being murdered or other awful things. Sometimes I feel like that memory isn't real, it was so incredibly strange and jarring. A dead body. I was about 10 years old and exploring the woods behind our school with 3 of my friends. We wanted to find the perfect secret spot to build a tree house that wouldn't be easily found. Turns out that this gentleman had the same idea when he chose this spot to hang himself. This really scarred me for a long time. A while ago, like 2 months ago, I found a machete that was buried in the dirt but not really deep at all. It looks like someone kicked dirt on it and walked away. I took it home to hang on my wall. Yesterday coroner and PD came to my mom's house after I found her boyfriend dead on the floor. They searched the house for drugs and took my machete. They came back asking whose was it. I said it was mine and I found it in the woods. The machete had dried blood on it that belonged to a girl who went missing not too long ago. I used to play in the woods by my house with my friends, and one day we found this abandoned home that we used to go and play hide and seek in. Years later we found out people used to go there and have satanic rituals. I do remember vaguely there was red/brown stuff on the walls, but I just thought it was paint. Looking back, maybe it wasn't. I once found 12 dead cats stacked neatly near a tree. I thought it was logs at first, but the smell was horrendous. I called the cops and local game warden and no one seemed to care. When it was apparent no one was going to investigate, I just buried them. So yeah. Go cops. When I was around 13 or 14, so this would be 1977-1978, me and a friend were hiking in the woods behind our house. We came upon an abandoned one-story house, very small, kitchen, bathroom, main room, and a bedroom. The walls looked like they were covered in both blood and dog shit. The bedroom area had wood across the bottom of the door such as to maybe keep a dog or dogs in the room, and from the amount of shit in there that's what we figured. Shit was on the floor and all over the walls. There was also a suitcase in the house. Opened the suitcase and it was full of romance novels, Barbara Cartland as well as Harlequin romances. They were all in mint condition. Yes, my friend and I took the books to read them. Hell, we were hormonal teenage girls. Today the woods are gone and there is a subdivision there. Not creepy but cool. We were hiking at Rock Island State Park and there is an abandoned gangster-type car from the 20s just in the middle of the woods. Has a plaque with it that explains moonshiners used to take hidden wooden paths to run alcohol during Prohibition. This one got stuck in the mud and was left. They never removed it. Kinda cool. Bunch of dog skeletons neatly lined up like they were in an obedience competition with bullet holes through the center of the foreheads. A different time I found a dog skeleton with the collar still on. I don't take my dog in that area. Or go there without being armed myself. Before people tell me to report this, it was a long time ago and very remote. Got an answer. It happened recently. This week actually. I was walking through some woods. I don't live near woods, it's just somewhere far from my house, and I felt a little off, and some strange things were happening, such as birds suddenly flying away, bugs suddenly going silent, etc. I decided to turn back as it was pitch black, and I pretty much knew where the exit was, but I was worried that I'd ventured too far into the overgrowth. The trails were not very well worn, and it felt far from civilization. Eventually I started hearing some leaves crunching. I thought it was just plants under my foot, but it was not in sync with my walking, but it was kind of trying to stay in sync as if to trick me. I called out but no one responded. Feeling creeped out I got a little jog on. eventually finding a path that led out of the forest, but I felt like something was right behind me, and I was checking over my shoulder quite a lot. I have always been a little uncomfortable about walking alone, but at this moment felt straight up paranoid. It was then that I saw it. On one of my routine back checks my eye caught something. It was something quite wide and short, with a metallic body, and a circular hole, window, differently colored spot in the middle, too dark to really tell. It pursued me slowly and I bolted it out of there. It seemed to be trying to communicate in some strange garbled noise, but I wasn't going to stick around and find out. So I got home, locked all the doors and didn't sleep much that night. Not going back there in the dark anytime soon, that's for sure. A few years ago I was out by the lake with my dad and 2 dogs. It was near a forest area that was surrounded by a lot of farmland. There were also some stables near the lake, so it wasn't unusual to see a group of people out riding. Well, me and my dad decided to split up so that our dogs will sprint from me to my dad and vice versa. They adore doing that. So I walk up a hill and reached a trail, and then I saw something. I physically stopped walking, frozen in place. I felt like I was in a movie or something. A few meters ahead of me was the leg of a horse. I got scared, but I wasn't 100% sure if it actually was a horse's leg, so I stepped a little closer to it. It still looked like a limb. So I stepped even closer. I felt like a complete idiot. It turned out to be a massive tree branch that was shaped like a horse's leg when you looked at it at a certain angle. I felt stupid but really relieved at the same time. We went to a hot spring in a national forest. It was way up in the mountains up a seasonally perilous road. The whole area was recovering from a wildfire that happened maybe 5 to 8 years earlier, so the vibes were a little weird. There was a car parked near the hot spring but no other cars or people. I figured somebody parked there and went for a hike. As we were leaving the hot spring and debating camping there, one person wanted to stay, 2 of us did not. I noticed that the car had expired tabs and flat tires and that it was absolutely full of stuff, including a family of chipmunks. The friend who wanted to stay immediately changed their mind and we left ASAP, but not before checking for any ID in the car. We found a bunch of old mail in the passenger seat, a bunch of bills and student loan stuff, which made the situation even more worrying, and looked up the name when we got back to service the next day. Dude seems fine, but it was more than a little worrying while we were there. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.